Hello, my name is Marian. I'm from the blog Miss Mustard Seed, and I'm also the creator of the Miss Mustard Seeds Milk Paint line. And in this video, I'm going to talk through applying the first coat of milk paint. I actually made a video for this a few years ago when the line first launched, and it's pretty rough. I'm just in my basement sort of slapping a coat of paint on the piece. And I think what's good about that is it shows like this can be really easy. It doesn't involve a ton of prep work and all of that. But what I failed to mention in that video is that with some pieces, they do need to be prepped. It just depends on what you're painting. Now, if you're painting something that's raw wood, all you need to do is apply the milk paint. And milk paint is absolutely the best paint for raw wood. It will soak into the wood like a stain and it will not go anywhere. So it's fantastic for that. If you're painting a piece like this that already has an existing finish on it, then some prep work may be involved. Now, if you're the adventurous sort, you can just go ahead and apply the milk paint and see what happens. And what you might get is some random chipping and flaking where the milk paint has resisted the finish, and that can look really great. It can have this really authentic, sort of shabby chic, chippy paint look. But in some cases, the milk paint will completely peel off of the piece. And of course, none of us want that. And you don't want to have to repaint a piece that you've already repainted. So if you don't want to just take your chances, you do need to do a little bit of prep work. Now, when we talk about sanding a piece to prep it, I'm not talking about stripping back the finish, and I'm not talking about this really lengthy, prep work that everybody's gonna dread. For a piece like this, the prep work should be maybe about 5 to 10 minutes. And so when I talk about sanding a piece, it's just very lightly rubbing the piece with sandpaper. This is a medium grit sandpaper. It's not too rough so it scratches up the surface, but it's rough enough to give the surface what we would call a little bit of tooth. It kind of gives it a little bit of something for the milk paint to grip. So I'm just gonna lightly run my sandpaper over this whole piece, just like this. And like I said, this should take maybe 5 to 10 minutes for an entire hutch like this. So for this piece, that's all the sanding I'm going to do. And if you noticed, I may have missed the sides of the shelves and stuff like that. I'm not gonna stress about it too much. I just wanted to rough it up a little bit, and it's amazing what a little sanding will do to help the paint adhere. And so I'm going to clean up now all the dust. You can either use just a clean cloth, maybe a damp cloth or a tack cloth, or you can also just use a vacuum. So that's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna grab a vacuum and go ahead and clean everything off so I have a nice clean surface to work on. I've taken about 10 minutes just to sand, and then I vacuumed and I wiped down the shelves of this piece because they had kind of a little bit of an oily residue on them, so they were a little kind of fuzzy. So I cleaned those up. Now, that is optional. You don't have to. There are some pieces, actually Christy's working on one right now, that we just put a coat of paint on. We don't sand it. We don't do anything to it. But we're sort of taking our chances there to see if the paint is gonna flake or how it's gonna react, because it can be unpredictable. So I'm going to paint the inside of this piece in Mora and the outside in Shutter Gray. We did another hutch like that, and I just love how it turned out. So I kept that one, so I'm going to do this one to sell. They're pretty similar. And I really don't want this piece to be chippy. Even though it's sort of primitive, I just think it might detract from it a little bit. I don't mind if it's going to chip here or there, but I really don't want it to chip all over the place. And it just might, because I do feel, it does feel like the surface is a little bit oily. So I've mixed up probably about 1.5 cups of Mora, and that may be a little bit more than what I need, but I'd rather have just a little bit more than not enough. But as you can see, it's not a ton of paint. A little bit of paint really does go a long way. Another tip is to actually mix the paint before you start to prep the piece. So during those 10 minutes, the paint has a chance to sort of absorb all of the powder to make sure it's really nice and creamy and mixed. It's better to let it sit for a few minutes than to just start painting with it straight away. So that's a good time to let it sit, is while you're prepping the piece. And since I don't want to have the chipping, I am going to add the bonding agent. Now again, you don't have to do this, but for this piece I'm going to. And the general rule of thumb is to add 1 part bonding agent to 1 part mixed milk paint. Because I have about 1.5 cups of milk paint, I would add about 1.5 cups of bonding agent. But I don't feel like I really need that much. I don't, this isn't a super shiny piece. If you're painting something that's really shiny, glossy, oily, then I would suggest doing that. So since I'm not doing that, I'm going to add probably about half that, maybe even about 1/3 of that. And I'm just gonna mix it in, and this is just gonna help the paint stick a little bit better. It also makes it a little bit creamier. It gives it a creamier consistency. As I'm working, I like to keep the stir stick in the paint so that every, 5 minutes or so I can stir it up just to make sure I'm not having any sediment sitting at the bottom, and to make sure that the color remains consistent as I'm painting the piece. This is especially important when you're using colors that have high concentrations of yellow and blue pigment, like boxwood, for example. They tend to separate from one another, and you can end up with a drastically different color at the end than you did at the beginning if the colors separate. So you want to make sure you sort of mix it as you go. And I'm not using any primer. That's what using the bonding agent means, that you don't have to prime the piece. So it sort of turns the paint into its own tinted primer. So you can get right to the fun stuff, which is putting the color on. And milk paint does feel a lot thinner than other paints. So you just need to kind of get used to that. The nice thing about that is it means that you don't see as many brush strokes, and it's also good to put on multiple coats. It won't start to get gummy or gunky or anything like that, since it's a little bit thinner. And I'm just applying it with a brush. You can apply it with a roller or with a sprayer, actually. Just make sure you have a sieve on the sprayer, or a strainer, so that you don't get any chunks going through the sprayer and getting it clogged up. But I'm gonna just brush it on. I sort of prefer using a brush because I feel like I can work the paint a little bit better. And I just kind of like the artistry of it. I used to use my sprayer a lot, and it just started to feel like I was just part of an assembly line. So I like using a brush, even though it takes a little bit longer. inside of this hutch, and it is a beast of a hutch to paint. Lots of surfaces, because I am painting the bottom of the shelves and the top of the shelves and everything. So I mixed about 1.5 cups of paint, and I did end up using all of it. And as you can see, the first coat looks a little scary, and this is where some people get with a painted piece. They'll put one coat on and they'll be like, it looks awful, and they're ready to quit and just put it on the curb. But just about every painted piece, in my experience, ends up in an ugly phase. It's sort of its adolescence, and you have to give it a chance to mature and get beyond that. So if you see that it looks uneven, you can see brush strokes, it looks a little drippy, yeah, it's going to look a lot better once you get the second coat on. So what you want to do, though, is go back over the paint and make sure that you don't have any drips or anything. There's some appearance of drips, but it's smooth. You don't want any actual drips, though, because that looks just kind of sloppy. So I'm going to check over the piece and run my brush over it. And the nice thing about milk paint is you can actually drag your brush over it as it's drying, and it's not going to start pulling off and be a big mess like it would if you were doing that on like a latex or something. But yeah, if this first coat looks a little scary, don't worry about it. It's going to look a lot better on the second coat, and I'll show that to you in our next video.